Before we begin this what if video, I guess I should probably talk a little bit more clearly about what the title means. In Revenge of the Island, the teams were made by every time someone like Joe, who came first, go on a team, and then the next person who crossed the line go on a team, and go back and forth until you've created the entire teams. But Chris did a very bad job of it, particularly two characters who passed the line at the same time. He conveniently ignored one of them until another person came, and then acknowledged the person he already crossed. So obviously I'm just going to be saying what if Chris did it correctly, and whoever person who arrived was then assigned to the said team. I did notice also a couple times rewatching that there were times where, like, say, just Brick went next and then Anne Maria went next. He would put Anne Maria on this team, but then for the next two people that would come, he would put them, say, on this team. So it works out number-wise, but I think it's not really fair, because now these two who have done better are on this team, so this team's stronger, and this team is weaker. It also doesn't really feel fair to list them in, so I'm just going fully raw. That sounds gross. I'm going fully genuine here, that the first person who arrives go on a team, and then the second person, then the third or fourth, and we're going all the way until teams are made. Now I have here in the arrival of which the teams were ordered. Now originally actually Joe comes first, but it is acknowledged later by Chris that Joe came first. However, he puts Lightning on a team first because Lightning's closer. And it's kind of weird, but I still count it because I don't really think it messes with anything too much. I guess theoretically, if this was like fully 100% correct by order, then Joe and Lightning were switch teams, but the genders don't really work for that. You'll see when the teams are done. But also he started with Lightning, so it makes sense to me that he'd just go Lightning first, then Joe, and then next was Scott, and then next was Brick, and then next was B. And then Cameron was on B's back. We have Zoe and Mike crossing at the same time. But in the clip, Zoe is in front of Mike, so I'm assuming that she passed the line first. So I'm going Zoe, and then Mike. Then we have Dawn, Dakota, Anne Maria, Sam, and Stacy. These are the official teams for the entire season. You see, right now I had Joe on this team because if it wasn't, Dakota would have been the only girl, and that would have been weird, so I decided to have that fixed just because it made sense to me. Generally, the teams stay mostly the same, which is kind of surprising considering how much he switches with his words and how much he's assigning people. It kind of just goes random when Chris is saying the teams. So I'm kind of surprised that the teams mostly stay the same. The only difference is that Zoe and Anne Maria switch places with Dakota and Sam. Because the teams are so similar, the challenge mostly remains the same. And also because B is on Toxic Rats, which has the hacksaw, and Brick is on the team that has the trampoline. And both B and Brick are the ones that like create the plans to be able to get the totems down. Brick jumps up on a hatch and makes it down, and B sacks people on top. I don't really see a reason why B wouldn't be able to do it with Zoe and Anne Maria. I'd argue they're probably better at it. I do think Anne Maria would be hesitant to get launched because she doesn't want anybody like land on top of her hair, so she would insist on going last. But that's the only thing I really see. Like, I don't think she'd be so against it that she just wouldn't go. Because she's been seen to like want to compete in challenges, so I don't think it's that big a deal. But now when they were riding the totems down the hill, originally on the maggots, Zoe is on the back end of the totem, and when they hit the ground, she flies off and Mike saves her. But now that Zoe isn't there, Zoe just wouldn't fall off. So I don't think it would happen to her if she was on this totem, because this totem just didn't have as much impact for some reason. So I was assuming that just Dakota would fly off, considering that I assume she'd probably still be in the back. And I'd say Sam saved her this time, which is sort of building to the rapport I'm going to have for them later. B would still have the plan to lean forward, they'd still get there, and they'd still lose. Now that Dawn and Zoe are on the same team, they did like kind of have a hint of a friendship in this episode. Dawn like reading Zoe's aura and telling her, you know, she's very lonely. And Dawn would probably want to try and help Zoe with that. So she'd like offer to be Zoe's friend, and Zoe would think Dawn's really creepy, but she isn't really the strictest for friends. She seemed very desperate in the first episode. So they would start a friendship. And I think for this team, Sam would get along well with all the guys. All the guys are pretty nice, and Sam's generally just kind of a nice guy. I do think Dakota would be a little bit outcasted by people just because she's really vain at the beginning, and I don't think anybody really likes her that much. And same kind of thing with Anne Maria. I don't really see her making any meaningful connections with anyone. I do think that she and Lightning would get along well, just because they're both kind of like veiny people. I don't think they'd be like a relationship or like, interested like that. They don't really seem like that. And as for everyone else, I just don't really see a connection. However, I do think Joe wouldn't like Sam or Dakota. I think she would view both of them as deadweight and not really want them. When it comes to the vote, I don't think there's any reason why Stacy would stay. So unfortunately, the queen, Stacy, the idol, the legend, the myth, the first spirit of the season is the first spirit of the season. The beginning of the episode with all the people in the cabins, I'm just going to order them by gender right now so we know who's in what cabin. We have Dakota and Joe in a cabin, and Dakota would still be trying to get her beauty sleep originally, but Joe would be like purposely like working out loudly to try and annoy her, showing that they don't get along well. Scott would still be out looking for the invincibility statue like original, and he'd come with the same excuse, and Limey would be there and he'd say it. However, this time, because B is originally asleep and Sam is like part of here, but now that Sam isn't there, I feel like Scott would want to try and build more of an alliance with Lightning. He'd view Lightning as very dumb and very manipulable, so I think he'd start like kind of hinting at Lightning that like, B really helped us out last challenge. B could be dangerous. B, could kind of take away your spotlight, and it would make Lightning upset knowing that B is being the star player for the team, which is what he wants. So that would just plant seeds for Scott using Lightning. Zoe and Dawn would be in the girls' cabin, and they'd be having like a little meeting of like friendship. Dawn would over psychoanalyze Zoe, making her feel uncomfortable, especially since it's in front of Anne Maria. But I don't think Anne Maria would really care. She's too busy with like her hair and stuff. Mike still does his talking in his sleep and still does his characters, but it's too early on for Cameron or Sam to really view that as something suspicious. They just think it's kind of odd. I don't actually think Brick would be there because originally he wasn't, because he was out for a morning jog. Joe, after working out in the cabin, would then go out for a jog and still run into Brick, and they'd still have their little meeting of like, team's lucky to have us, we're the two strongest players. On the way to the challenge, I do think Zoe and Mike still have a bond, and they'd be, because originally when they walked to the challenge, all the teams are together because they're just walking to like this setting spot. So Zoe and Mike would be talking a lot, since they both are interested in each other. However, while they're talking, Joe gets mad at Mike for talking to the enemy and like pushes Mike away, kind of rubbing him the wrong way and also just being bossy. When it comes to the actual challenge, I don't think anything really changes too much. I don't have a reason to believe it would, because everything that's in place still happens. Brick would admit to peeing his pants to get a point. B would admit to his name being Beverly for a point. Then when they go under, Scott would be attacked by Fang, and then everyone would want to quit and not be a part of it because they think challenge is too dangerous. And this would mean that Scott still has a rivalry with Fang, so that wouldn't change. Joe would probably make fun of Cameron like she did in the original, and originally only her and Anne Maria were the ones to laugh at it. Everyone else was nice enough to not make fun of Cameron as well. I do think Dakota being a little vain would also do it, but Sam would kind of confront her a little bit and be like, that's not nice, kind of making Dakota realize, I don't want to be a nasty person, that's not really what I'm like. And Sam and Dakota would still bond over their electronics being taken, and it would still be a nice moment. When it comes to the challenge, it's really hard to tell where the new people for the teams fit into the challenge, because I genuinely do not have a factor to tell me where they go. Because there wasn't anything in the episode where Chris was like, everyone go to your positions based on the letter of your name or date of birth or, a personal choice. Like, I have no way to tell who goes where. Chris just said get in positions. So I'm keeping everyone who can be in their same spots originally. And I have the two spots, obviously, like Sam and Dakota. So Dakota was last and Sam was second to last. So Zoe and Anne Maria are going to be in those spots, and then Zoe was second to last and first. So now, those spots are open for them. So they basically take over the spots there, but I still don't know which one, Dakota would be first or Sam would be first. So I just decided to do a wheel to tell it. It isn't the most accurate, obviously, but I genuinely just have no idea to tell. So I guess this video should technically be called What If the Teams were assigned correctly, and what if Dakota didn't get first but she got first, so whatever. And then Zoe got first for this team, and Anna Maria got last. So these were the orders for all the challenges in the relay race. Lightning and Dakota are for the big boot. I think Dakota would be given the disgusting maggot, and she'd be so distracted that she wouldn't really have time to process, and she'd get kicked by the boot all the way to Brick, giving the maggots the lead, but Lightning would quickly follow behind, jumping across the platform and maybe taunting a little bit, hearing what Scott said, and then gives it to Don, so he's not that far behind. Same thing happens with Don and Brick. Brick runs into a wall because he's Brick, and Dakota just makes it pass, gives it to Scott. Then Brick gives his to Joe. Scott delays a little bit, obviously, because he's trying to throw, but Joe makes up a lot of time, so B gets like a bit ahead of Sam, but not a ton, like maybe a minute or something. B still does the same thing of making the like mud beaver he makes to distract them. And when Sam goes across, the mud beaver would be broken and he'd fall down. And he's not, I don't know how to say this. He would die. This was a realistic thing. He would die, but in total drama logic, you know, people get hit by planes and are fine. So Sam would be fine, but he would lose a lot of time because he would just get destroyed and mauled by these beavers. Because I don't see a way in which Sam like escapes them. And I don't know who would want to go help him. I don't see Dakota wanting to because she's like too vain at this point and too involved into paparazzi and everything. And like, who else is realistically gonna go fight a mutant beaver? So Zoe would be really far ahead when it like comes to time, but she would obviously fall a lot on the bouncing balls. So it would take her like maybe 3 tries, and then when Sam gives his to Mike eventually, Mike would just become his Svetlana and make up a lot of time. I'd say Anna Maria, maybe they like are about the same, but Anna Maria has like still a little bit of a lead. I think that Anna Maria would win with the bats for 2 reasons. The fact that Dakota was really close to beating Cameron originally, and Dakota is obviously just not the best at challenges, but also she lost mainly just because she was vainful and didn't like keep going in the challenge. But Anna Maria I don't feel like would get distracted that easily. I think she just continue the challenge until she gets it. And also it was seen in the next episode that Anna Maria's hair acts as a wall that cannot take any damage. So when it comes to the bats, like, she wouldn't feel any of that. And I would be more willing to say Cameron would win had he, like, actually won by something of his own skill. Like, you know, his actual calculations of things. But originally, Cameron just, like, gets lucky. Like, his maggot attacks him, and then he just kind of hits every bat, and then falls on the mat. It's like, he didn't actually do anything to provoke it, he just kind of got lucky. So I'd assume now that the toxic rats would win, and the mutant maggots would go to elimination. Now, it was really tough to figure out who gets eliminated here, and I mean really tough. I've done, like, these 4 episodes like 3 different times, because each time I've had someone different eliminated here, and then I get about here and I realize, no, that's not what would happen here. And the reason why this is so tough is because the mutant maggots do not go to elimination ceremony till really far into the season. I don't think they don't go till here. They don't go till 1 episode before the merge, so you really don't have a clear-cut idea of the dynamics of the team, especially now that Zoe and Anne Marie aren't there. So here are the things that I noted to try and consider what would be here. First things first, that there is not a team leader. Joe is not a team leader yet. She gets classified as a team leader in episode 3. But right now, she's just kind of a bossy person. Same with Brick. He doesn't really respect her as a leader because, again, she's not a leader. Sam and Dakota get along really well. And Mike and Cameron actually haven't really like started a friendship at all yet. They're kind of just, you know, people. They don't like hate each other or anything. They're just people. And I couldn't tell who Joe would target because, in my opinion, these 3 are all viable for elimination from Joe. I could see a reason why she'd want all of these people gone. So I couldn't tell who she'd target the most. But I think in general, just because she is such a, you know, tomboyish girl, she would want Dakota gone, especially since she just seems like she's not really trying that hard. So she would vote for Dakota. I imagine Dakota would obviously vote for Joe, and then Sam would obviously vote with Dakota. But as for everyone else, I don't know who would vote with Joe. Mike doesn't like Joe because she separated him from Zoe. Cameron doesn't like Joe because Joe made fun of her. Brick doesn't like Joe because he feels like she's really bossy. I mean, maybe he likes Joe a little bit because they had a talk where, like, she said he was a strong player, but even then, that's still a 4-2. Joe, one of the most crucial members of the entire season, and the future team leader for this team, is out this episode. Early on, she wouldn't have any sort of layer to protect her from all the consequences of her actions. Okay, in the next episode, new maggots would be a lot calmer as a team now. Everyone would be a lot less stressed now that Joe is not a part of it, since Joe was being really domineering. Dakota's paparazzi originally in this episode gets barred. Well, like, technically next episode about, but roughly around in the time gap between these episodes, they get a restraining order on them. So I'm just going to say now that Dakota has no paparazzi. They have a restraining order. They can't come here. So that really kind of bums Dakota out since she can't have them come take photos of her. But Sam is happy because he feels like it will help her be more involved in the game and actually help. Dawn and Zoe would be sitting next to each other in the cafeteria, and Dawn would obliviously mention Zoe's crush to her without anybody really hearing. The point is that it's just showing more of like Dawn's social unawareness about like you can't just really tell people everything and you need to be more secretive with that. And obviously kind of upsets Zoe a little bit and she feels like she's walking on eggshells with Dawn all the time. But they'd still be friends. The first part of the challenge would play relatively the same. Brick for the maggots would make it up normally first, but obviously not for his whole team as there's no way Dakota, Sam, or Cameron, maybe Mike, but there's no way these three are gonna get up the mountain, obviously not. And also Brick wouldn't dislocate his arm because the entire reason he did that is because he was trying to impress Joe, but she's not here, so he just not do that. Dawn would still fix the Beatles family problems. Zoe would be thankful at this point and realize how valuable Dawn is as a person and how nice she is and just kind of accept that she has a weird standard for her friends. I don't know who would get beat up by the Beetle. Maybe it's Scott, maybe it's B, maybe it's Anne Maria. It doesn't matter. B would obviously still come with the same plan, getting everybody up on top, and Brick would be the only one on top, obviously giving Toxic Rats the win for the first part of the challenge. Brick would be kind of upset seeing how weak his team did, and feel like he wants to take more initiative charge to help the team do well, since he did obviously want to be a leader as we saw in this episode, but got challenged by Joe. But Joe isn't here, and also I think he's genuinely liked by these people. I don't think any of them have a reason to dislike him. So they would all agree with him becoming the leader, and Cameron would probably be a little bit extra supportive, thinking Rick's military experience would come in handy. Now, the Toxic Rats winning the first challenge originally advantaged in the next challenge of choosing which snow shelter they want, but Scott is still on this team. And originally Scott chooses the shitty one because he thinks it's good. And I don't see like any big personality here. Like, I guess Anne Marie is a big personality, but I don't think she cares about the challenge enough since she didn't care about the challenges. And there's no way Zoe, who's meek and quiet, is gonna like speak up to him. Like if Joe was on this team it'd be different, but there's no big like figure here who would question Scott. So they'd still get the shitty cabin and everyone would be mad. However, I do think Zoe trying to be nice would be much more defensive and try to tell the whole team like it's not his fault. He didn't know what he was doing. It was a mistake. And Scott would kind of keep that in mind for later, that Zoe's very nice and also manipulable. Brick would have Sam and Dakota as attackers, since he generally doesn't view any of his team as like actual attackers, but he just wants Dakota and Sam out there since he feels they're not really the most useful, so they can go out there and just distract. And then you can have Cameron, who's really smart, work on the shelter. God originally signs himself, B, and Dawn as protectors, and that would leave Zoe, Lightning, and Anne Maria as attackers. The challenge would stay relatively the same, except originally Joe froze Anne Maria's hairspray to get her fighting. I think Scott would just do that now and she'd go out there. Lightning would use Anne Maria and Zoe would still be against it. Lightning would obviously use it because he wants to win. Sam would still become an ice cube, and Dakota would eventually get him out of the water, but because she's not built like Lightning, she's obviously not going to get him out quickly. Now she's more challenge oriented since the paparazzi isn't here to distract her, and Sam is being supportive to her, which is making her feel good. But besides that, everything else basically stays the same, and the ending still works out the same since Sam still turns into an ice cube of Scott sabotaging B's magnifying glass to make it hit Sam, which in turn melts their entire structure, and you'd call him out. Scott convinced everybody to vote out B so easily originally. He'd already have Dawn and Lightning, and with Dawn he'd also get Zoe, so that's already enough. I mean, maybe he couldn't get Anne Maria, but it doesn't matter, be it 4-2. B would go home, basically. I don't see a reason why I wouldn't be able to convince these people again, because since he already did, there's not much room for questioning there. Okay, so originally the Toxic Rats get to the clue first, and Joe insists on them leaving to go follow them, but now that Joe isn't here, they wouldn't have that plan. However, I don't think it matters since Scott is still throwing challenges. Once he finds a clue and once they talk about what direction to go based on the stars, he would do the similar thing he did to this episode, where he would just make a arrow with his foot, like go this direction to help out the other team. Dawn gets captured first quickly. I don't know how. We didn't even see it, but she just did. Considering that Zoe doesn't really have any friends on this team, she wouldn't really be like looked after, so I think she'd also get caught fairly quickly. The rats would still get the clue, and then the maggots would show up shortly behind, and Mike would ask about where Zoe is. And Scott, knowing that, Mike and Zoe talk, would know that it would upset Mike if he knew that Zoe was gone. So he tells Mike, planning to make him freak out, and he does it like he did in the original. And Sam would get caught by the spider for the maggots, which would cause Dakota to freak out a bit. Brick this time not actually having Joe to discourage him to go, no man left behind. He'd probably go in the woods trying to find Sam and just tell his team to go on without him. This would kind of cause Dakota to fall into the leader role, since Cameron is too nervous with the whole talk of spiders and being nighttime, and Mike is just way too preoccupied trying to find Zoe. Dakota's the really only one who can kind of have a structure of following her to the challenge. Mike would still be calling out to Zoe on top of a tree, but he'd fall off and he'd lose his shirt, and Anne Maria would eventually get to the grave at the same time, and Vito would come out, causing them to make out like they do in original, and causing them both to get caught by the spider, since now they're just both alone because the teams aren't there yet. Eventually Cameron finds the grave, and Cameron, being smart, would be able to make the clear connection of, numbers. Scott would probably see them working on it and then also get the clue. Dakota and Cameron would get to the cave first, and Dakota, kind of being afraid, would send Cameron ahead, but Cam would quickly get caught by the spider like he does in the original. The rats arrived quickly after them, and Scott, still wanting to throw the challenge but couldn't really do too much at this point without it being obvious, would just kind of trip over to get caught, and he gets caught, oh poor me, because I don't really see how much he could do without it being plainly obvious, so I just assumed that he would just trip himself and just get caught to not really be a part of it. Also knowing Chris said for each person you lose there's a penalty, so he's hoping if there's only one person at the end, if they could get two, they'd win. Something like that. Basically, he just threw a challenge by getting himself caught. But Lightning would still go really quickly to go grab a hook. Since he's challenge-oriented, he wouldn't really care about helping anybody or being afraid. And the spider would be too preoccupied with trying to get Cameron and Scott on the web. So Lightning would quickly grab the hook, and probably, Brick would yell at Dakota to go... Oh yeah, I didn't mention it, but I think it's pretty obvious that when Brick went to go find Sam, he got caught because he was by himself. Brick would then yell to Dakota to go run and get the hook and try to beat Lightning. Cameron would still break through the web, saving everyone in the cave while collapsing the cave. Doesn't matter. Lightning and Dakota would get to the end, but because Lightning was way ahead, he'd get the win for his team just because even though there's an even number of players that were lost on both teams, Lightning just made it first. So the maggots would go to elimination ceremony. When it comes to the maggots, I think everyone would be really upset with Mike because he kind of just made out the enemy and he's already been talking to Zoe, and people just kind of view him as not really trying for the team and not really helping the team. So they'd go to vote him out. But this is the episode where Chris has a twist that whoever gets voted out in this episode is a new member of the other team. So Mike wouldn't be eliminated here, Mike would just switch teams. Now this is actually originally the episode where Cameron watches Mike in the morning and realizes he has multiple personality disorder. But now that Mike is in this male's cabin, Cameron wouldn't have a chance to see that happen. So Cameron wouldn't know. Scott would continue stealing things, planning to eventually plan it on the new guy, which in this case is Mike. Hasn't done it yet, obviously, but is still doing that arc. When it comes to the challenge for the dive, Brick would probably insist for this team for the dive, also just because I don't really know who else could dive. Cameron definitely couldn't, Sam definitely couldn't. Dakota maybe, but the suit they had to wear was really heavy, so I don't think she could either. And Lightning would probably insist on diving just because, he was kind of a show-off and he wants to show off, and also he'd just be the best at it. I think Lightning wins that pretty handily because, he's just more athletic than Brick, and Brick is still, even though he's falling in a leader role and he's being more honorable, he's still a clumsy guy, and he's just not, that well coordinated, and also he has maybe 3 of the weakest people in this season pumping his air, so he wouldn't, get any help, really. Mike, Zoe, and Anne Maria still have the same scene they have originally, with Zoe talking to Mike saying, tone it down a bit, and then his shirt falls off, and then Vito comes out, and Vito and Anne Maria flirt, and Zoe gets upset. Toxic Rats would win the nice boat, and Union Maggots would win the shitty boat. Lightning originally wanted to be the driver the most, so he'd still probably be the driver, and Scott still wanted to be a shooter, and I think Scott would want to be the shooter since he said it was like an FPS, which, he's a gamer, so he'd like that. And I do think Brick would be the driver because he'd want the 2 lightest people on the back so they don't drag him too much. Now, there's a big chain of events that happen here with Joe, but since she isn't here, we'll just go through it. So originally, Joe shoots Lightning, causing him to fall down, causing the rats to fall behind, causing Scott to take a random shot at a bell and it's somehow hitting. But now that Joe isn't there, I don't think Sam would want to waste a goal on shooting Lightning since he kind of used that as a little cruel. So now the rats wouldn't fall behind, so Scott wouldn't really have an opportunity to fake shoot at a bell because he just wouldn't need to. So he'd just go head forward, but Sam would go and shoot the goal at the bell since, that's what he planned. And I think since he's so much of a gamer, he'd be good with the gun and he would hit the bell. However, Mike would have troubles being Svetlana because Cameron isn't on the team and Cameron's the one who kind of knows how to instigate characters in him. However, since Dawn does know about his disorder, she's hinted at it, she obviously knows, she would still be able to bring out Svetlana and Mike, so she would still, know how to use it, and she would set it up, and Mike would become Svetlana, and that would score the rats the next point. Now, because the mutant maggots still got the shitty boat, Sam's gun would still jam, since that wasn't an issue with Joe, that was just an issue with the gun being bad and the boat being bad. The rats would still be way far in the lead since they've never fallen behind during the challenge, about a win, and Scott still knows I have to fill the challenge. That's what my plan is, so he does the same thing he does in the original. He shoots the driver, which in this case is Lightning, causing the rats to crash. And now the mutant maggots don't have goals to shoot at the bell, so I was kind of just considering is this a tie, because I don't know how they'd get the bell. But thinking about it more, I think Cameron would realize, since he's some sort of nerd with numbers and stuff, if they drift the boat at a certain time, then Cameron, Dakota on the back would be able to drift into the bell and then drift out and they'd get the bell. So I'm just going to say that happens because it makes sense to me since he's that kind of character, which would cause the maggots to win the challenge, taking the rats to elimination ceremony. Dawn would still realize that Sam's gun was jammed, so it had to be Scott, and Scott would have to blame it all on Dawn, and everyone would fall for it for Dawn. I think maybe Zoe would be more hesitant since she views Dawn as a good person and they're friends. However, I don't think it matters because it's still 4-2. But even in the case, I still think Zoe would just feel heartbroken, and this would be kind of a chance where Scott realizes he could build a rapport, and he kind of talks to Zoe and apologizes for her friend not being a great person and her figuring out this way, which makes Zoe feels a bit more comfortable, but also sad that Dawn was a bad person, which she wasn't. The rats would use the maggot, since I think that was originally Mike's plan to use something smaller, and then Zoe found the maggot, so they would still be there to do that. And the maggots would use the Sasquatch since Brick is still there and Sam is the one who pointed out the Sasquatch. When it comes to the actual design of the clothes, everything stays relatively the same since Zoe's still on the team with the maggot and Brick is still on the team with the Sasquatch. But since Dakota is here, and for now there won't be a communication error about the stripes, so Sasquatch will get the correct stripes now. But I still think the Yeti would get mad that, he was forcefully clothed and still get upset and then still take Lindsay to the island, so the first part doesn't even matter. So why'd I waste your time? Sam would still follow the storyline of making real life appear as video games since that just happened and there's no reason for that not to happen since he still doesn't have video games. Originally it was Cameron's plan to send someone prettier at the top to get the Yeti's attention away from Lindsay, it was a plan. And it works out really well because Dakota's on this team, so they would still follow through with that. The rats originally, I think it was Scott, it was kind of like a Scott and Laming duo plan to charge the Yeti, so they'd still go with that plan. So what I'd go with is that the rats would try to, swarm it like they did originally before. It wouldn't work. Then Sam would go and do his whole thing where he almost gets it, but he doesn't. Then Dakota would go with her makeup, but honestly, I don't know why the Yeti would care if she's more attractive. I don't think that's why he kidnapped Lindsay. It wasn't oh, pretty lady, take. It was just I'm mad, I take. So I think the Yeti just wouldn't care and he'd probably throw her off. And then while the Yeti's being distracted by Dakota and Sam, the rats have enough numbers for the plan to actually work now. Originally they only had 3 numbers, but now they have 5. I mean, maybe Anne Maria wouldn't go, but even then they have 4, with 2 of the other ones being very agile people. So I could see them definitely getting to the top and taking down the Yeti. So in this case, the rats would win, and the maggots would face elimination ceremony. Quick update on the relationships real quick. I think Cameron and Brick have been getting along really well now since they're on the same team. They've been sort of building a mentor relationship with Brick helping Cameron through the challenges and Cameron respecting Brick as a sergeant. So Brick's kind of training Cameron and they're building good rapport. Sam and Dakota begin to somewhat start dating. They don't make anything official yet since they're still on the show, but they confess that they like each other and they both confess that, they want to pursue something outside the show. Cameron and Brick, obviously we're at an impasse here where there's 2-2, but Cameron and Brick, in my opinion, would be able to convince Dakota that Sam has to go because Sam's just sort of losing it. Like, it's in his best interest to go because he's clearly just losing touch with reality and he's becoming drained. He should get back with his video games, like a drug addiction. And even though Dakota would be really upset because she really likes Sam, she would agree since Sam has kind of lost it. So they would get rid of him, but, it wouldn't be harsh or anything. Sam would understand. He'd wish his team the best. He'd tell Dakota to keep going, all that. There's no hard feelings. Before we go to the next episode, Chris gives the opportunity for one strong member from each team to volunteer for switching teams. They obviously don't know that yet. He just says he needs a volunteer from each team that are strong. Brick would obviously volunteer since he's the strongest out of Cameron and Dakota. And I think Lightning would volunteer, but Scott got to it first. He just did. Lightning's there, but I don't see him being abrasive enough to get past Scott because Scott just originally does it quicker. So I just assumed that Brick and Scott would switch since Scott beat him to it, because originally it was Scott and Joe. So I have no reason to believe it wouldn't still be them. But Joe isn't here, obviously, so it's just be Brick and Scott now. And they'd switch teams. Now, unlike the original, Scott would be a lot more upset about switching teams since he doesn't have any allies here and he realizes that these two are a lot closer than he is to any of them. So he would probably be a lot more upset and he'd probably drop his plan at this point of sabotaging challenges since he just doesn't view it like there's many more team challenges. And also it's a team of 3. Him trying to make them weaker doesn't really help him at all. Everything leading up to the challenge would play the same. No reason that, these people being here would affect anything. Lightning originally yells Shabuya or something. I don't fucking know. He yells something in the mind and it causes the rocks to fall down and gives the maggots the lead originally. I'd assume that still happened. He'd yell it, all the rocks would fall on these people. The maggots would get ahead, they'd get the flashlights, they'd fall down the tunnel. But Brick was the one who came with the plan to just scale down the elevator line. So they'd still do that, but the maggots would have a lead. Maggots would reach the same 2 tunnels they originally reached with Manitoba. And Manitoba tastes the dirt or something. And he's left is minecarts, right is bunch of blind gophers. But Scott said he wanted to go right because right is right. And even though he's not trying to throw challenges, that's just Scott being dumb. So the maggots would go right, and eventually the toxic rats would follow behind way later, and Manitoba would still come out, and Manitoba would tell him to go to the minecarts, and they all like that, so they go to the minecarts. I imagine Lightning would be cocky and want to be in the front one, and Manitoba wants to be in the front since he's Manitoba. Zoe and Anne-Maria and Brick would be in the back one. This matters because the minecarts get separated. Lightning and Mike would end up, I guess, near a ledge, and Zoe, Anne-Maria, and Brick would land in the water. And since Anne-Maria is still there, Anne-Maria would still get kidnapped by Zeke. And even though Brick would want to go find Anne-Maria, I think Zoe would be kind of more worried about Mike. So she'd insist that they leave and that Anne-Maria is probably okay. Since I just don't know where they'd even look. Where do you look for when someone's just dragged underwater? Are they just gonna start diving? Maybe they do that for a bit and they realize it doesn't work and then they go anyway. Either way, it gets resolved and they just continue on. Lightning would get mad when Manitoba gets knocked out and kick him around and then tell him to get up. Manitoba would still be upset and drowsy and Lightning would carry him. Eventually they reconnect with Zoe and Brick and they would hear Anne-Maria celebrating about a diamond in the main room, which is where Zeke is. When it comes to the maggot side, I don't think anything super interesting is happening. I'm pretty sure they'd all just get kidnapped like the rats originally do. They just get kidnapped by the gophers and get taken to Zeke's room. And then they go to the doors. Maggots are in the mouths of gophers. Everyone here at the rats is at the front door. And then Anne-Maria is in a chair throne. So that's the locations of all the people in the Zeke's room. Scott would wait for once the rats come in and then the gophers would be distracted with the new people just arriving. And Scott would slip out of the backpacks they have on their back, which are bombs. I saw in the original when I was looking at the episode that the gophers don't actually hold originally Lightning, Brick, and Joe by their necks or something. They hold them by their back. So Scott would just slip out of the backpack, run to try and grab the statue. Lightning would probably sneak past the gophers since he's really agile and strong and athletic to go and try and get the statues too, but Scott would still get there first. I also think Lightning getting past the gophers would distract them, make them really confused, so they'd all just disperse trying to look for him. giving all the rats the opportunity to get into the room. Lightning and Zeke would still get into a fight, causing him to drop the statue, which Brick would get. Scott would obviously still, actually want to win the challenge, so he'd be more protective about getting everybody into the carts, which he would be successful at. But Mike and Zoe would still fall behind a bit and need to be saved. And since Brick is still on the team and Brick still has the statue, he'd go and save them by breaking the statue over the gopher's head, which would cause the maggots to win. Lightning would be really mad at Brick since he's really, obsessed with like winning and being strong. However, I don't think even a vote would happen. Even if it did, I don't think it would matter since Brick and Mike and Zoe are all on the team. And obviously Mike and Zoe would be thankful for Brick saving their lives. But I think before a vote could even properly happen, since Anne-Marie originally just quits in this episode, she's going to be actually just at the vote. She would just save time by not having anybody vote and just quit. Obviously if the diamond's still falling fake and whatever, but that would still happen and Anne-Marie would still go there. Cameron is the one who doesn't trust Scott in the original, and since he's still here, he obviously still wouldn't trust Scott. He just gets a fishy vibe from him, and he'd make a deal with Dakota that if they lose, they'd vote for him. And Dakota would agree since she also doesn't really get a good vibe from him. So we're starting to feel a little bit better about Mike now that Anne-Marie is gone. Obviously, it still isn't perfect since, she still knows he's kind of a cheater. But she still just feels now more uncomfortable with Mike's characters in general, feeling like they're interfering with her getting to know him as a person. And Lightning would still be really mad at Brick for throwing the challenge. And this would kind of start a rivalry between them of just Lightning constantly blaming Brick for things. The challenge starts with all of them on rafts, and originally the maggots aren't able to row because Dakota becomes Dakota Zord and she gets real angry and she throws the sign which they use as a row. Obviously none of that happens and Dakota isn't even mutant anymore. And both teams just go pretty normally, but since the rats have more people and they have Lightning who's a steroid jock, they'd get further ahead, meaning that they would run into the big squid first. Cameron would still have the same plan of taunting the squid, causing the squid to hit their ship, causing all the maggots to make it to the land first, and them having the advantage in the next challenge. The advantage originally is a map and a compass, and then the punishment is metal belts attached at their waist to their hands. Mike wouldn't have Cameron to help him keep in check of his multiple personality disorder, so his personality started to come out a little bit more this episode and be, still harming to his relationship with Zoe, and she'd still start again to kind of feel uncomfortable with him and feel like he's hiding something. The map leads them into the swamp since it's quicker, so they'd go into the swamp, and Scott wouldn't actually set the arrow with his feet this time to tell the rats to go into the swamp because he's not throwing the challenge. But the crazy thing about this is that them following the compass and the map actually makes them go a lot slower, because what would happen is they'd get in the swamp, but originally there's that massive thorn bush that they cannot get through. And the only reason they do get through it is because Dakota Zord throws the alligator into the thorn bush, knocking them all off. But normal Dakota can't do that. So now they would just get through the swamp and see the thorn bush and realize we have to go back, which would give the rats a massive lead, and they wouldn't really need any location or anything to figure out where it is because Gwen is yelling in the box. So the rats would very handily, in my opinion, be able to win this challenge, which is kind of crazy considering that the advantage really kind of screws over the team that gets it because Dakota Zord isn't here. Well, either way, that would cause the maggots to go to elimination ceremony. Both Cameron and Dakota would follow through on their deal and they'd vote out Scott. But Scott in this episode has already found the invincibility statue and he would play it, and I wouldn't know exactly who he'd vote for, but I do think he'd vote for Cameron, since Cameron is the one who just didn't like him more and was the main person who didn't trust him, but also he knows that they're about to go in the merge, and even though he doesn't view Cameron as per se a threat, he does think that he's smart and that he's dangerous and that again he's onto Scott, so it's better for him not to be there. And with that, we're at the merge. Oh fuck. Whatever, back in deadline. Yeah, let's continue. Mergecast is looking relatively the same with the 4 main people, except now we have the new additions of Brick and Dakota. Big thing first is that Scott wouldn't be able to use Mike this episode as blackmail, which is a big plot for this episode in general, but he wouldn't be able to do that now since he doesn't know about multiple personality disorder. He doesn't know anything about that. He wouldn't have known anything from Cameron because Cameron wouldn't have revealed any of that to him. Also, Cameron doesn't even know, so he wouldn't have been able to figure it out from Cameron. So Scott just doesn't know and he can't use that as blackmail. Since they have rejoined, and he realizes that Zoe's become, more loyal to Mike than he has to him, he would, plant seeds in her mind and just talk to her about Mike and be like, it's suspicious, it always feels like he's hiding something with all his characters. And Zoe would agree since it's a feeling she's kind of had for a while now. And when it comes to all the keys, I think everything kind of mostly stays the same. Everybody would find a key, except now Mike would find the golden key in the trash can, but he wouldn't give it to Scott since he doesn't need to give it to Scott. I'm just going to say Dakota would kind of look the same place that Cameron did since it makes sense, and Dakota would find the nuts and she'd use those to distract everyone. I'm just saying this because if nobody finds the nuts, then the challenge just can't happen because then everybody would get caught by Chef. So I'm just saying that she found the nuts like Cameron does originally, and she used it to distract the squirrels. I do think still that Brick and Liming would get caught since, they're both kind of bigger people. And now Mike would be essentially just out of the challenge since he got the gold cart key, which is not a cart. It's just kind of like a cart with 2 back wheels and then cinder blocks for the front wheels. So he can't even move forward. Mike is just like out of the challenge. He's not part of the challenge anymore. He's not part of the totems or anything. He can't get to them unless he ran, but I don't even know if that's allowed. Zoe would be first ahead, Scott would be short behind, and then Dakota would be a bit more behind. First, area they have to tag. Zoe would get there first. Scott would go up and then, talk more about Mike, try to plant more in the head that he's untrustworthy. Then he'd go and Dakota would come up seeing that Scott just talked to Zoe, thinking it's suspicious, and remembering what Cameron said about him being a bad guy, wanting to warn Zoe a bit, saying she doesn't trust Scott and that Zoe probably shouldn't either. Zoe obviously doesn't trust Dakota since she's been talking to Scott more and she kind of trusts Scott a lot more. Lightning would still bend open the bars to get him and Brick out of prison. He would push over Brick to try and distract Fang to get them to go. So now they start racing, but they're kind of behind a little bit. When it comes to everything else, I don't really see how too much changes. They'd still get the second ones, and then Lightning and Brick maybe be able to make up a bit of a time. But I don't think there's any way they could beat Zoe, especially since in the original, Zoe was set to win until Scott, working with Mike, was able to throw Zoe off. So Zoe would just win the challenge in my opinion. Everything else when it comes to the 4th one that was added doesn't really matter too much. But I guess if it really, to any degree matters, I guess Zoe would go there. And then Lightning would be able to catch up like he does in the original. And he'd go and he'd say get rid of Brick. And then Chris would say no, it doesn't exist. That's about it. When it comes to Zoe winning, it's kind of hard to tell who she chooses to get rid of. I mean, obviously she wouldn't choose to get rid of Mike since she loves Mike. She wouldn't choose to get rid of Scott since she trusts Scott, and she wouldn't get rid of Brick since she's still a little bit indebted to him for saving her life and she just genuinely likes Brick. And she wouldn't really have a reason to get rid of Dakota either since she just hasn't met Dakota and she kind of probably likes that she's another girl. Lightning, she has a lot of reasons to get rid of since she views him as arrogant and mean, and also he's just a massive threat in the game. He's extremely athletic and she would know that, and she would be the sole vote getting rid of Lightning. When it comes to choosing the aircrafts, I could not tell you who gets what, why they get what happens with it. There is no rhyme or reason, they just put their hand in a bag and they get an aircraft. So again, I used the wheel and I spinned it, and this is the order that we were given. Dakota gets the hot air balloon, Brick gets the helicopter, Zoe gets the plane, Mike gets a rocket, and Scott gets a bird. Now, I wasn't originally going to have Zoe and Scott retain the same ones that they had originally, because I figured, random with it, might as well make it everyone, because it makes more sense. But they actually ended up getting the same ones they got originally on the wheel, so that helps me a lot, because I don't have to figure, what they would do and how they do it, because Zoe and Scott would just do their things the same. Dakota and Brick have obviously gotten along well since they've been, working for most of pre-merge. Just not this one. So they work pretty well, and I think at this point they'd kind of agreed to a temporary alliance of just friends, and they'd help each other get through the challenge. Also wanting to get rid of Scott since I imagine, Dakota would talk to Brick about Scott and saying he's untrustworthy, and Brick hasn't met Scott really at all. I don't think they've ever been on the same team. So he wouldn't really know, but he does kind of get a fishy vibe from Scott. So they'd work together, and I imagine they'd help each other create their own aircraft since they aren't too complicated. I mean, Lightning was able to create a helicopter, so Brick figured it out. And Dakota's was just a parachute and a heat source and a chair, which isn't, that's not that complicated. Again, Cody can make it. It's they're not that complicated. However, Mike has to create a rocket, and Cameron was the only one who with any actual knowledge about how to make a rocket. I think Mike's shit out of luck, and I think Mike would also realize that. I think Mike would just kind of give up on the challenge knowing he doesn't have any chance at all, and he'd probably just go talk to Zoe, and Zoe would still be really, really wary of Mike. But this time she'd actually just start talking with him about it, telling him that his characters make it feel like it's really hard to get to know him, and Mike would feel really bad about it. But they'd still, talk, and they still kind of get along well, but it'd be really awkward and wary now, since Zoe's had a lot of Scott telling her he's a bad man. I guess Dakota would finish hers first. Maybe there's an argument for Scott, but Scott seems to actually take some effort. And in the original, Joe completed hers first. She just didn't go to Chris for some reason. So I don't know. But I'm assuming Dakota go first just because in my mind, making hers feels easy. Like, not easy, but compared to making the other things, it feels generally easy. So I'm assuming she'd get it first, and because her and Brick are working on it together, I'm assuming, double the manpower, and that would cause her to get the smoke machine. Mike would ride Riv Zoe for the part of the challenge, since he doesn't have the vehicle. Heather would still take over the ship, and that'd become the new challenge. When she's throwing Jemmy's at people, she'd throw a Jemmy hitting Mike directly in the head. Mike's, fighting of his personalities was caused by Scott hitting him over the head with a club. So now that he got hit with a head with Jemmy, I imagine that sort of thing would happen again, where he has to start fighting in his mind for, control over his personalities. And Zoe would still be there, so Mike would be able to overcome that. And this is when Mike would just tell her everything about multiple personality disorder. And obviously it's kind of a hectic scene, so it's a lot more going on. But he'd apologize, and Zoe would feel a lot more trustworthy of him. Scott, being a part of the challenge, would still have to get past Dakota, which she has a smoker screen, so I imagine she'd just be able to smoke him. And since Scott's the only one where, you can't cover his face because his flight device is his arms, I'm assuming that would mess with him a lot and cause him to not have a chance to win, because just how would he be able to inhale smoke and try to fling his arms? I just don't see it. However, I don't think Dakota could actually win the challenge, because I don't know how she'd get on Heather's ship. A hot air balloon isn't fast, it's not fast with forward momentum, it's just kind of goes up, so she wouldn't be able to get onto Heather's blimp or zeppelin or whatever it was. But Brick could, because Brick has a helicopter, and Lightning was the one who originally broke through. I could see a real case for Brick being able to do the same thing with the help of Dakota's smoke screen. And I just assume in this case that he'd fly through the window and Heather would still crash, giving Brick immunity. Now, there's a lot of moving parts in this vote. First things first is that obviously Zoe and Mike are running together. Obviously Brick and Dakota are running together to get rid of Scott since they don't trust him. However, Zoe and Mike don't have a strong reason to not trust Scott. In fact, Zoe and Scott are actually kind of friends. Mike, with his own girlfriend vouching for him, and considering the only reason he really heavily distrusted him was because of Cameron, who he never talks to about Scott now in this world, I think he just wouldn't distrust Scott. I mean, maybe he'd get a 50 vibe, but he wouldn't get enough to want to vote him out. So those three would talk, and they'd agree to vote out Dakota just because she's the only one that's not free of them. But Scott, in my opinion, wouldn't want Dakota gone, since he views Dakota as pretty weak in challenges, and generally just if Dakota goes, then Zoe and Mike would always be more loyal to each other than they would be to him. And Brick is not working with Scott anytime soon after he just voted out his ally. So he would kind of be stuck where he'd have to vote with Zoe and Mike and then hope he can win the final challenge, and Scott would realize this since he's smart. And instead, he would go to Brick and Dakota and say, hey, Zoe and Mike are going to be voting for Dakota. I know you guys are targeting me, but I want to get rid of Mike since he's good at challenges, and I don't want Zoe to have all this power. Brick and Dakota would both be feeling bad about it because they don't want to vote out Mike, but they'd realize it's either Mike or Dakota, so they'd go along with Scott's plan, basically kind of blackmail more than plan, and they'd get rid of Mike. Zoe would obviously be very heartbroken and feel very betrayed by Scott. This was when kind of Scott would just reveal everything, that he's been using her and that she's his tool and that he's here to win the game. Scott would do the same thing with Zoe he does originally about voting together to get rid of strong players. Zoe would obviously be very against it considering he just voted out Mike, but Scott would bring up the point of Rick and Dakota being a lot closer, so if, Zoe gets rid of him, then it's two strong people who are going to work together and not going to take her to the end. And Zoe realizes this and she's upset, but admits that Scott's right, and she kind of considers it, but is also just really mad. Rick and Dakota would both be really mad at Scott saying he's a really nasty person and not liking him. Obviously saying that was a one-time vote, not working with him again. Scott is kind of being smug and realizing that he can make these things move and he's kind of controlling all the moving pieces right now. Scott would be still setting up snares for the Fang because him and Fang still have a rivalry, which does mean that Chris would still be picked up by one of his snares into the restroom. That's all I'll say about that. Causing Chef to have the challenge, meaning the challenge would still mostly remain the same. When it comes to the food making, I don't think anyone would be good. Obviously, we know Zoe and Scott isn't that good. Dakota seems like she has a rich dad, so she probably has a butler that cooks for her, and she's never cooked before, I'm imagining. And then Brick is just generally not good at things. I had a really hard time telling who would win, because now Scott can't even manipulate somebody to get their good food. There just is no good food. But I do think that it's between Brick and Scott, because in my opinion Scott would still sabotage Zoe and give her poison ivy, and there's no way that Dakota would be able to mouth down something gross better than these two. So it's between these two, but I think Brick would be able to make something a bit more edible. Originally Scott copies Cameron, but Cameron's not here. So I'm assuming Scott would copy Brick, thinking that he's got the best idea. So he'd just make a worse version of what Brick's making, since that's what he did with Cameron. So Brick would make something probably kind of gross, but Brick, being a military, would be able to gunk it down and probably beat Scott by like a little bit. You could say I'm wrong about this and that Scott would be able to win, but it doesn't matter, and I'll tell you why later. So we'd obviously then get the advantage of not having to wear the tracking collar that shocks him. Dakota and Brick would probably travel through the forest somewhat together, but I do think Dakota would say it's more important to Brick to get the immunity than like work with her. Scott would go through the forest a lot more afraid now and a lot more scared since he has the tracking device, because it's just a tracking necklace, and we know that Chef follows Zoe first, so Scott would have a while to like get a lead. But talking about Zoe would still have all the circumstances to become Commando Zoe. She'd still have the tracking collar, she'd still be heartbroken and mad about Mike, and she'd still be knocked down the thing, and she'd still be born as Commando Zoe, and all the Commando Zoe stuff would still happen. And then I imagine the ending would kind of play out similarly. Brick winning the challenge would just get to the post and just win, and Commando Zoe would still be, agitating Chef. And why it doesn't matter if Scott had won, because you'd say, oh, Scott won the challenge, he'd be able to not have the necklace and he'd be able to get close, is because Scott still has a rivalry with Fang. So Fang would still block him off, and Fang would prevent him from getting to the end, and then Commando Zoe would hit him with the boulder, and then, Brick would probably still come up anyway since Brick's the most athletic out of the two, and Commando Zoe doesn't really seem to care about winning, so either way, Brick would still win the challenge. In fact, it's actually kind of better for Scott in this world if he doesn't, because he gets more brutalized. When it comes to the vote, I don't think Zoe gives a shit about what Scott said anymore since she's Commando Zoe. I don't think she'd care about like challenge strength since she views herself as a strength, and she wants to be able to like win now to be proving to herself that she deserves to be at the end. So she'd vote out Scott with him being the bad guy to get revenge for Mike. And same thing would happen with Scott with him getting brutalized by Fang and getting Shark Tooth. All same stuff. Brick and Dakota would both be in the cafeteria really freaked out by Zoe's transformation. They'd both kind of try to talk to her about it, and Zoe would kind of take a somewhat villain role for the rest of the season, which is 2 episodes, not a big deal, but Zoe would be really not talkative, and she'd be just really cold-hearted, not caring about anyone's feelings. And when it comes to the challenge, everyone is given a piece of the map. Commando Zoe, obviously now being mean, just wouldn't want to work with the map. She'd just start maybe like swinging off the trees like she does in the original. And Brick and Dakota don't really seem the smartest, but Brick being part of the military could definitely figure out a map. However, I think Commando Zoe is just like really agile. She's really, really, really agile, just out of nowhere. So she'd be able to explore the forest a lot more, but she wouldn't really know exactly where to go. Brick and Dakota wouldn't be able to cover a bunch of ground, but they'd actually know where to go. So they'd both find Larry at a relatively similar time. And Brick and Dakota are very much working together at this point, wanting it to be like a friendship finale, same with Zoe and Cameron, just wanting to make sure that they both get to the end without Zoe. I'm just gonna say that mostly with Brick and Dakota, it's basically the same idea of like what happens with Zoe and Cameron. Dakota goes on the stepping stones, it's a turtle, they fall back, then they have a plan, then they have the same plan as Cameron, realizing that they can't get to the flower quick enough, and Brick would hang Dakota with a vine over the flower, but Commando Zoe just swing in from a vine like Lightning does and get the flower first. And originally, Lightning gets attacked by Larry sooner, causing him to lose the flower and then causing Commando Zoe and his Cameron a chance to get the flower. But Commando Zoe, I imagine, is a lot more agile than Lightning. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch. Not agile, but like she's just a lot more quick than Lightning, because he's kind of a huskier guy. But Zoe can like do flips and, dives and stuff like that with relative ease. So I'd imagine she just wouldn't get caught by Larry, and she would get to the end, and Brick and Dakota would, not win. And Zoe, considering that Brick has won the last 2 challenges now, would get rid of him, viewing Dakota as easier competition. And then when it comes to the end, obviously they both just get different winning endings. Hi, it's me again. This is me editing now. I realized editing the clip that just ending the video really quickly on having the 2 finale winners without actually saying what happens in the finale was kind of boring, considering the entire character development I've been doing for Zoe and Dakota ends at the finale. So if you only care about this what if video fully on a results basis, then you can leave now, because the results are, that's the elimination order. That's the finale. but I figured for the people who are more interested in the story that I would go through what happens in the finale to close up the story in a full. Right after the last challenge where Brick got eliminated, Commando Zoe would be acting similar to Lightning, being really cocky to Dakota, thinking that she can beat Dakota in just about anything because she's Dakota. When it comes to the beginning of the challenge and there were videos from home, Zoe would have her mom video of her and her mom would see her dressed up as a crazy person, and Zoe would get kind of embarrassed and we'd see sort of hints of Zoe's old self before she became Commando Zoe. Dakota would get the video call from her dad, who was happy to see her, but Dakota acts a bit standoffish, feeling like her dad is the one who spoiled her, telling her, always to be rich and peppy and absorbed. She kind of blames him for the way she became a really vain person when she was on the show, and just turned away from the TV without saying a word. Actual challenge, I view no world in which Dakota can beat Commando Zoe in any sort of basis. She's not strong, she's not smart, she's not agile, she's not even good socially. But I did want to keep the total drama thing of having alternate winners for each season, but I don't like the idea of buffing Dakota a bunch for this one episode just so that she can have an alternate winning, or just her getting lucky. That feels a bit weak. So I decided to try and alter the challenge just a tiny bit so that way Dakota actually has an ending where she wins and it doesn't feel forced and fake. So I decided to do something that's not too outlandish for total drama and seeing something we've seen in other seasons finales, which is helpers. And since Chris was really insistent on having the original teams for each finalist cheering for the finalists from their team, and I have one from each team so it works out perfectly, it's just pretty easy that Chris would say Zoe can choose 2 helpers, one of each gender, to help her in the first part of the challenge, and same thing with Dakota. Now when it comes to Dakota's options for a female, there's only Joe who's a female on this team. So by default, she just gets Joe. She's not very excited about that. And as for the guy she would choose, she obviously wouldn't choose Mike because Mike would help Zoe. Wouldn't really want to choose Sam, and even if she did, I think Sam would be too nice and just tell her not to choose him because he doesn't want to interfere with her chances to win because he's not the most competent challenge person. I think Brick comes pretty close, but Chris would inform the finalists beforehand about what the helpers will be helping them with, and he would tell them that they're the ones who are going to be going through the big trash pile to help make armor, and Dakota, hanging out with Cam and a bunch, would obviously know he's smart and he would be good at making. Commando Zoe, when it comes to choosing male helpers, she obviously wouldn't want Scott since, come on. Also, he's in the suit now because of the Fangs thing, so he wouldn't even be a useful helper. I don't think B is really someone that she had much conversation with, and even then, she'd still choose Lightning, because since she's Commando Zoe, she doesn't really care about friendship or anymore or anything personality differences. She just wants her strongest people, and Lightning is easily the strongest challenge performer on the entire cast even. And when it comes to female helpers, again, it's also kind of easy. There's no way in hell she's choosing Anne Maria, and Stacy's just annoying and useless, so that leaves Dawn, who she has a good connection with, what she'd obviously lean to. When it comes to the actual helping, Cam would end up making a similar suit that he made for himself, but for Dakota. Lightning wouldn't really want to help Zoe originally, since he's not like that, he's arrogant, he doesn't want to help her win. But Commando Zoe would be able to manipulate him into helping her by saying if I won, you technically get first place as well, which makes Lightning really cocky and arrogant. He wants to get first place, so he ends up helping Zoe. He kind of just ends up making the same sort of thing that he made for himself, similar type of armor for Zoe, and the same weapon that he had for himself, which Commando Zoe isn't really that worried about since she's fighting Dakota, so she thinks it's not really that big a deal. Dawn would be vaguely helping with the actual creation of weapons and armor, but she would mostly be talking to Zoe about how she looks and reading her aura and telling her that she looks lost. Zoe has a confessional where she then says the whole reason she's acting like this and the whole reason she's trying so hard to win now is because she feels bad that her 2 friends, Mike and Dawn, are both gone because she trusted Scott when she wasn't supposed to. So she wants to be able to win the money to make it up to them and make their sacrifices not in vain. But when it comes to Dawn actually confronting her, she stays pretty quiet and distant because she doesn't really know what to say. Joe and Dakota would have a talk while they're kind of sitting on the sidelines watching Cameron make the suit. Dakota would be trying to have a conversation with Joe and be nice since she kind of feels bad and apologize that she went out early. Joe wouldn't really care and just kind of be quiet, saying thanks, one-word responses. But Dakota being able to kind of read people a little bit better since, talking to all the people she's talked to, Sam, Brick, Cameron, she's able to get a better read on people and can kind of tell that Joe feels uncomfortable with the way she looks compared to other girls. So she tells Joe she shouldn't worry about those things as much and that she should just be herself. And that kind of touches Joe in a personal spot, and she starts to like Dakota a bit more and warms up a bit to her. When it comes to the actual fight itself, I think most things stay the same. They both have the same suits now that Cameron and Lightning originally had. Only minor things is that obviously Zoe just wouldn't be as dumb as Lightning and be a lot more agile, so she probably wouldn't get hit as much as Lightning, and she wouldn't take as much damage. And Dakota wouldn't really know what the hell she's doing anyway because it's a robot suit, so she needed help from Cameron, so that also would, cause Zoe not getting hit as much, not really as much damage. But she's also not as resilient as Lightning, so it's kind of middle line. Dakota would do the same thing that Cameron originally does to Lightning. She would get near the end of her battery, she would get near the end of her armor's life cycle, and Cameron would tell her about the setting to turn someone to a magnet. So she turns Zoe into a magnet, overpowering her suit, and then Zoe gets striked. And the winning endings are the same thing in the original. Dakota would fall in the robot suit, and then Zoe would fall on top of her, or Zoe would fall, and then Dakota would fall in the robot suit. In Dakota's winning ending, everybody celebrates with Dakota carrying her up, leaving the scene. Mike and Dawn comfort Zoe, who's on the ground crying, apologizing to them for getting them both eliminated, but neither Mike and Dawn even care about that, and they just want the old Zoe back. Zoe smiles, dropping the Commando Zoe headband, putting it on the ground, and taking Mike's hand to help her back up. At the boat, Dakota is asked what she will do with the money, and since Dakota's parents are already really rich, Dakota tries to spend the money on something that isn't selfish, and decides to spend all her money on things everyone else wants in the cast, akin to what Cameron did originally. And when it comes to Zoe's winning ending, she celebrates winning days from the lightning strike, and she offers her money to both Mike and Zoe when she gets, somewhat consciousness, both of which don't care about the money and just are instead asking if she's okay from the lightning strike she suffered. Zoe confesses the same thing, she wanted to win to make it up to them for getting eliminated. Again, Mike and Zoe say they don't care, and they just want the old Zoe. It's much more of a public thing now because everyone's not celebrating away with Dakota, everyone's just kind of watching it. And once Commando Zoe drops the headband and takes Mike's hand, everybody cheers for her as she appears to become the old Zoe again, and Dakota even compliments her white hair, saying it suits her. At the boat, Sam asks Dakota if she's okay if not winning, and Dakota is completely fine with it. Dakota says she's rich, she'll be fine, she's glad she didn't get the money, she wanted Zoe to have it more, and she was glad she was able to come on the show and meet Sam, which is much more important to her. And that's all the filler things to the alternate endings. If you stayed this long, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you all so much for the support I got in the last video. It was a lot of effort went into a video, so it was kind of nice to see it get a lot of recognition. I hope that if you did watch that video and you're watching this video now, you're enjoying what I'm doing. I do plan on doing more of these. I already have a couple other video idea scripts going. If you haven't already, you consider subscribing. Yeah, I'm one of those YouTubers now. I'll ask for your subs and I'll send feet pics to get them. Just cut that. Cut that shit.